Hello everybody, how are you going? And welcome to Reverse Culture Shocks returning from America after moving to Australia. Quite the mouthful, but also quite the topic in terms of what could you possibly be seeing differently now that you have new eyes after moving to a different country.
Hello, welcome back to the channel. I am back in Australia from America. I went home to visit family for a bit, and I really wanted to sit down and recap it because I just realized so many things that just made me really uncomfortable or made me feel really out of place going back to the US that previously never was an issue, as in reverse culture shocks. So these are my reverse culture shocks of going back to the US after moving to Australia. Also, I am not in Hobart right now. I am in beautiful Canberra, and I will explain everything in the next video. But for right now, we're gonna chat culture shocks.
Ugh.
I got a coffee. So this trip—
Oh, it sounds like I don't know how long she's been in here, but the way that she said coffee almost took like just the nuance, the smell of a coffee, not the full taste of how you pronounce it, but just the top in terms of how she pronounced it. She just didn't pronounce it like I would have thought she was going to pronounce it. And like I said, I don't know how long she's actually been in Australia for, but it also seems like she's moved around enough, and so she is going to have more than just one city's perspective, whether that's Hobart or whether that's Brizzy or whether that's Canberra. In this case, I do think that is a very important thing to have in these kind of comparison situations, because you might be going, well, Sydney's different to Chicago, and that's the only comparison that you're making instead of one country to another.
So this trip home, more than anything, I realized how extreme the tipping culture has gotten.
Right.
So I knew that the tipping culture has become a bit more, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, over the last couple years since the pandemic. Like when I was growing up, I was told like, okay, if someone gives you amazing service, like table service or something like that, 10%. And then as I went into uni, it, with inflation and everything, went to 15, and then post-pandemic, at least where I was from in the US, it was 20%.
Wow.
And
I'm already a little bit confused by that, and I have seen plenty of things about how companies have become more forward with where they actually placed all their tipping, whether that just be on almost services that don't require tipping, on top of the fact that the percentages have become super ballooned. Like the minimum, I've seen sometimes people going, what is it, like the 20% minimum tip? So then for her to be saying that she grew up with 10% being an excellent service charge, and I don't know, I guess you go down from there, maybe 5%, to hear that it's now up to like 15, 20, even higher, that's pretty crazy. Considering it's a percentage, it's not a dollar figure. So in terms of just keeping up with inflation, the percentage should already cover that. So why is it then increasing the percentage even more exponentially? Like you're eventually going to be paying more for the service than the meal. Like you're going to be tipping more than you're spending on the whole thing, which I don't see how that would ever be feasible.
even going back to the US, because I've been back to the US a couple times since I've moved over to Australia, and it's like stood out to me a little bit, but I kind of just like put off the side, like, you know, I grew up used to it, so it's not that big of a deal. But I don't know what it was this time around that the tipping just felt so out of control. I've never been chased out of a bar aggressively for being told that I didn't tip enough, when in my opinion, I felt that I was receiving zero service at all. I had to go find my own glasses, I had to go find the bottle of wine, the customer gave it to me, and then a random person, I don't know if they worked at the bar, followed me and my brother across the street and approached us and was calling us mean names. And that's just never happened to me before.
Yeah. Of course, that is only one particular example that she is gleaning on, but if that's going to be the kind of environment that is even allowing or making people feel a certain way to where they are going to chase you across the street because not that you didn't even tip, as she said that she did tip, but they expected a higher percentage tip, and so to be chased across the road after having that experience is almost like there's two completely different sides to the story there. But just that seems crazy, to be chased across the road just for the tip. I mean, I understand that's some people's livelihoods, but to some extent that's just kind of the situation that they're in. You can't be forced to tip 45% every time.
And that's just never happened to me before. And it's really jarring going from Australian culture back to American culture, that's for sure. Like another example is I was at the airport and it was a self-serve kiosk, and I scanned my own item. I was paying at the FPOS machine, and it was like, do you want a tip? And I'm like, but who am I tipping? I went and I got the item, I'm scanning my item. There's not even like workers like around to like make sure if anyone had any questions or like if there's technical issues, like there's really no one. I'm like, who am I tipping? Am I tipping a robot? Like, I'm genuinely confused. And there's also so many like hidden service fees now in the US that I experienced. and stuff. And I also want to preface, I completely understand that there are still so many industries in the US that are severely underpaid. Well, I mean, unanimously worldwide, but specifically in reference to like the service industry in the US, I completely understand.
Yeah.
And 99% of the time, I don't have an issue tipping. But I think now it's just become so out of control, and it's really overwhelming.
Hearing her talk about that just makes so much sense, and it also just sums up a lot of what international tourists feel in this entire situation, which she almost is in this situation. If she is now living overseas and then just traveling back, almost being a tourist in your own country, you can understand how, like I said, if you have that perspective shift, then it's a little bit strange. And even for people that are living in the States, they're finding it difficult, let alone if you're coming from a no tipping culture into a majorly tipping culture. That's going to be quite the shock. But it's also interesting for her to have that perspective, because I feel like it's a very common gripe for international tourists to have when traveling to the States, and almost something that they don't want to travel to the States for because they're overwhelmed by it, or they're intimidated by it, or they just want to try and avoid it. So people then don't tip because they go, well, I don't know what I'm doing. And as much as I want to respect kind of the situation that everyone's in, I just disagree with the entire situation, as wherever they are from, they just don't do that. And that's not what they've grown up with. So then it feels weird to be tipping, especially, let's say, common example would be like Japan. It's generally frowned upon to tip because I've heard that it's an insult due to saying that, oh, you're too poor and you don't get paid enough, here's that extra money, like charity work. And they're going, no, we do pay our workers and we do facilitate the entire needs of the workforce. Now, I am also curious to know, how is Canada faring throughout this entire process? As for so many things, they are very, very similar countries, the USA and Canada. But let's say in a place like Quebec, if you have so much of the French influence, and I don't believe there is that much tipping in France, how does that whole interaction evolve, especially as numbers and percentages in this case do just keep rising?
Number two, just the service industry in general is so different. The level of service, like going off the tipping thing, on top of the increased frequency of tipping in the US, I also feel like the service has just gone down severely, like the standard of service, which again, to play devil's advocate, I understand and agree that service workers in the US very much so deserve to get paid more, but also I just feel like in Australia, the minimum service standard, as a result maybe of the increased wages comparatively, the service standards are just so much higher. Let me know if you have noticed that too, if you've been to both the US and Australia and have noticed differences in just like service standards.
I mean, that is surprising, as I feel like so much of what I've been told, at least, is the fact that in the US, service is like top tier because everyone is trying to get as much tip and the highest percentage as possible. They're kind of fighting for your tip, so to say, and that's what the entire tipping culture is meant to breed. I believe it's trying to make people work for their money, so to say, and just make the entire experience better, which then brings back customers, and that makes the entire industry go round. But for her to be saying that the tips have become so much more forward and in your face, and the percentages have increased, and also the service has actually slipped majorly, that is quite surprising for her to be saying that. Now, the minimum is definitely lower in the States. That's kind of what I gleaned from that, at least. And in that regard, I feel as though over the last few years, there's been a bit of a storm of things that have come together to really make that a reality, from the quiet quitting and people not wanting to work extra hours, and then people not wanting to also work minimum wage jobs because they can't afford to, literally, because of inflation, and then so they have to be getting more tips, but then people are just pushing back against the tips, to then even what she's saying about with robots requesting tips. Like, usually my interpretation of a tip is it's from me directly to that person, unless it's a tip jar, but where does the robot and how does it distribute it? But if it's a tip from one person to another, that makes sense, because they did XYZ service. But if you're giving it to a robot, like she said at the airport, then how does that possibly distribute it, and why? It's meant to be like a service fee, literally, for serving someone. If it's a robot, what, are you just paying it off faster?
Like, I commented on this last time I went home to the US, and I think I was just not far from where I'm from in New Jersey, and there was like a kiosk that, it was like a self-serve kiosk at a coffee shop, and it kind of took me aback that the person behind the counter like didn't even greet me, didn't even look my way. I was just at like the self-serve kiosk and then asked for a tip, and I was like, I mean, I tipped, but I kind of felt a bit uncomfortable. I don't know, it would have just made me feel a bit more comfortable if you said hi or like looked up from your phone. I don't know, maybe I'm just being like really nitpicky, or maybe we're just really spoiled here in Australia with genuinely how lovely most service experiences are here. But next up.
That's just weird to be asking. I think she said they'd asked for a tip after receiving no service, like she said with the airport. That's 101 weird. But then also to be having, like I said, no service, even for her to be saying, even if you could just look up off your phone, I mean, it's like, why are you even there? Are you there to make the coffees? And also, why is there a self-serve machine in a coffee shop? Unless you're talking like Starbucks or something, they probably have them. But if it's a generic coffee shop, like I don't know what you would call it. I don't even know if really North America has them. But if it's just a generic coffee shop, that's weird. That seems like that's a massive outlay that the shops generally don't do. To be scribbling a little thing on a piece of paper compared to be buying a massive thing like that, that doesn't seem to make much sense. Like, the machines aren't cheap and the workers are cheap, so you might as well just pay that person instead of 50 grand for the self-serve machine. But I guess that's what they've done, and that's just seemingly quite strange. And maybe that's coming, like she said, from a spoiled perspective, but I just don't think that's very humane.
Next up, reverse culture shocks. Cafe culture. Woo! Again, I've commented on this in the past, but the fact that in Australia it is so custom in so many cafes, the barista brings you your drink and you don't have to clean the table yourself afterwards, whereas in the US, most cafes that I've been to, it's custom that you go up and get the drink yourself and then you bus the table yourself. There's bus bins, and some places even have like sanitizer bottles and cloths to wipe down the table yourself. And also, to preface, in the US has a tipping culture as well. So when I first posted about this, a lot of people were like, well, what are you tipping for if you're cleaning the table yourself? I'm gonna leave it open-ended. Please comment below.
Jeez, if you were really going to that extent, I'm now wondering, well, my entire world is crumbling in on itself as maybe it's a new thing. But if you are then basically serving yourself, besides having the thing made for you, there's no service. There's kind of like manufacturing of the item, but there's no service mixed in there. And so then to be tipping that, if you were even cleaning the table yourself, I mean, I don't know how much mess people are really making, but it kind of makes sense in that regard. But then what are you tipping for? Especially if they are then like, well, here's the items and you need to be using them. And she said bus bin, and I was like, what is that? But then I was thinking like a service bus bin. I don't think that word has ever been used in an Australian context ever, but I can only imagine that it's like, yeah, here's the bin for everyone to serve themselves and clean up for themselves. I mean, it kind of makes it go round. And I think from what I've heard, the cafe culture is a little bit different in terms of people sit there all day. Maybe that's why. So people aren't kind of constantly checking to see if you've gone, if you've been there for 8 hours. Perhaps that's a reason. But still, to be cleaning up your own table, and even what, you return your drinks and your glasses and everything? Like, is that what it is? That's all nice. You can do that, but it's certainly not expected in Australia, and you're not tipping for it. It's just all part of the package of the price of the coffee.
It's just, I don't know, I just felt like this time going home, it was really disheartening because I just feel so much more welcome and at home here in Australia, and especially as time has passed, going back home, it doesn't like feel as natural and as seamless as like previous times I went home. Maybe if you want to do like a number 4 of reverse culture shocks, like drink sizes. The amount of times that I would get a coffee when I was home this last time, and they were massive. And growing up, I had like no issues about it. I was so used to it. Even the last couple times I went home, I was so used to it. And then this time, I don't know what it was, but this is massive. I ordered a small coffee, and it is like bigger than this. And I felt like I was struggling to finish the coffee most of the time. Like, I felt like I was half drinking it because the small is so massive, especially for iced drinks. Gosh. Oh my god. I just feel like so spoiled here in Australia and just beyond grateful. And I'm sure there's like other reverse culture shocks that I've noticed.
It really just does sound as though she's all of a sudden had this massive change of heart and mindset towards the two countries, and just really an understanding of what's going on, because you now have enough perspective on both, and so you can actually see what's more normal and what you like, and what's then weirder and what you don't like out of the two countries. And that's fine and well and good for any country to be having, especially to be able to have the experience of traveling like that, but still to be suddenly feeling more at home in one country than another, especially if it's not like you've been away for 10 years and then you come back after 10 years. That's of course going to be happening. But if you are going back in over a couple of years' time, if you are going back multiple times and then suddenly having a big change, that's quite almost impressive. And I do wonder, was there anything in particular that makes that happen? Was it moving from Hobart to Canberra? Was it moving down to Tasmania? I don't know. There's so many different cities and places you could be that could suddenly open your eyes up and give you more context, so you aren't just comparing one city to another. But even just the coffee sizes, like to go, I went back before and a small was fine, and then I go back now and I can't even finish it. That's a huge difference.
And I would love to just hear in the comments, like, if there's anything that you've noticed, like going to the US, or if you're from the US coming to Australia, because I do find it really interesting. And you guys know me, of course I'm gonna comment about it, and I love making videos about it, but it's just like, I mean, none of these topics are revolutionary, like none of these are like prime original topics, but it just really got to me and just really caught me off guard, especially getting chased out of a bar, violently yelling and calling myself, Brady, and my brother names.
Wow.
Because this person didn't think that we tipped enough. Yeah, it just makes me sad, because it's like, I understand both sides. I'm just going back to the tipping thing. I understand both sides to an extent, working in the service industry in the US for however many years, how much it does suck to feel like you're doing so much, but getting nothing in return, like pay-wise, benefits-wise. I understand that. Obviously to an extent, because disclaimer, like everyone's situation is different. But also, coming from Australia, I'm just like, I love when I go into a cafe and people look up and acknowledge my existence or say hello. I'm not expecting like a red carpet and someone to ask me about my life story, but I love a greeting. It makes me feel so welcome and so comfortable, and just makes me feel heard. And I just love the experience of going to a coffee shop. You guys know me. And yeah, I don't know, I just feel like I felt like I left the US quite deflated.
Oh, as much as it's, I guess, sad to hear, it's also just so interesting to hear, because it's just kind of challenging the mindset that so many people have about the USA. Like, it's always been the golden country, the American dream, all that stuff for so many decades almost. And then now to hear multiple reports that it isn't exactly what it used to be, for so many different things, and whether that is little differences, like in her case where she talks about tipping and coffee culture a lot in this entire video, and that's fine, because if that's what your minds are really honing in on, just from going back one particular time and going, oh, I do actually want someone to look at me, and I wish that was a thing, and then I also don't want to tip a robot. That's also another thing. Like, there's all those little things from all these different people that are giving different reports, and some people are going, yes, we love this, state to state. I'm sure it's also different, especially in the US, because there are quite large differences from state to state, where in Australia there is less so. It's more of a nation compared to the United States of America. But then again, I guess if you did want to be putting a positive spin on the entire thing, from her perspective, you could be going, well, I'm glad that I chose the right country to move to. Like, I'm actually glad that I'm living over there, and I can always come home, so to say, back to where I was born, but there are things that aren't for me anymore, and that's due to my perspective change. And if I'd never moved, I never would have had them, but I'm actually found myself more, and that can be the great thing about traveling, especially for long periods of time, whether you're moving to the UK, whether you're moving to Australia, whether you're moving to Peru, it doesn't matter. There's all these little things that no country is ever going to be perfect at, and other countries can really show you what you're missing out on, so to say, and whether that's a red carpet at the front door or no red carpet at the front door, but you just have to give up that you might not be able to get fireworks and firearms and as cheap cars and things like that. Like, if that's the kind of trade you want, coffee and not cars, hey, the Australia is going to be here.